Hello, greetings, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, everyone, depending where you are. Welcome to Connect Africa. So today, here on a weekend, at this time of the hour, we are here live streaming on the topics that we have been following closely ever since the development started to happen, which is Egypt basically sending army weapon and its military to Somalia following their agreement that camps are made against the background of a lot of things in the region. So uh, for today, we have our guest to analyze here also a family, Lambert Ibitu, who is a Pan-Africanist and a founder of Africa Interest, a writer, a very eloquent speaker as well. Yeah, welcome, Lambert. It's a pleasure to have you here. Lambert, did you hear me?
Mahlet, sorry, can you hear me now?
Now, yeah, but did you hear me before?
Yeah, just sections of it. I heard you. You've asked me to join. Okay, thank you, Mahlet. I heard you introduce me. Thank you for the elaborate introduction.
Okay.
Pan-African writer, founder. This. I hope I build up to that. But thank you for that.
Okay.
I will only ask you to 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 repeat the last sentence you said so that I can begin from there outside the introduction.
No, it's okay. I was just welcoming you and saying it's a pleasure to have you here.
All right, it's my pleasure too. It's been a while since I last featured
Exactly.
on Connect Africa. Thank you, Mahlet, for the good work you do. Thank you for the effort connecting Africa, giving us the opportunity to discuss a number of subjects which are of interest to Africa. I think you are among the very few Pan-African organizations where we get the opportunity to express our views and not only to react to developments as pertain to Africa, but also to set the agenda on a number of African subjects. So thank you for having me again on this show today.
I think it's a pleasure, and really, the pleasure is ours. Yeah. So now, without any delay, let's go. Let's dive into the subject. Now, to put it in a perspective, the general topic is Egypt's militarizing Somalia now, and its impact not only in Ethiopia, but not only to Ethiopia, but the Horn of Africa in general. And you are also not only Pan-Africans, writers, this and that, but you are from the region, so you definitely are able to share how it feels like, this thing playing out in the region. Okay, now, so recently, Egypt has deployed weapon actually with two aircrafts, military aircrafts of Egypt landing in Mogadishu, unloading army, and also a military, which is called the initial phase, 10,000 army of Egypt. Just to put it in a perspective, the national army of Somalia itself is about under 15,000. It was the last registered was 14,000. It gets and less each year. So that is the number of military from Egypt just on the initial phase. Now, Egypt's army arrival in and its weapon arrival in Somalia is, of course, now Somalia is going to evacuate the African transition peacekeeping mission in Somalia, which was called ATMIS, that replaced basically the AMISOM. And then when that evacuated, so the African Union has promised to replace that ATMIS in another 12,000 troops. Okay, now to speak to the tension between Ethiopia and Somalia, how it is arose, we have it started when Ethiopia signed that memorandum of understanding with Somaliland, which is a direct access to the sea for Ethiopia, and then Somalia has threatened that, saying that Somaliland is part of Somalia, and then we have seen the Egypt government following President Sheikh Hassan also threatening and saying supporting Somalia's stand against Ethiopia, and we have seen also Turkey now, following that, so basically after 9 months, so Somalia during that course for the past 9 months has announced to evacuate the ATMIS. And in ATMIS, we have basically 5 countries, which is from the neighboring countries, Burundi, Djibouti, Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia have contributed to this army of ATMIS. So following the evacuation of that, Ethiopia has basically 3,000 troops in ATMIS, but it's totally around 14,000, okay? Now, after that, the other development is a peace talk led by a non-African state, which is Turkey. Turkey has an interest in Somalia. We all know it's basically running the defense and maritime of Somalia currently, the whole maritime of Somalia, and defense and Egypt are fully, Turkey and Egypt are fully in Somalia. It's all these are in the background. Now, recently, we have seen Egypt unloading army and then sending its military. So Ethiopia and Egypt have their historical animosity, GERD, and Egypt militarizing and providing logistics to all oppositions in Ethiopia. That's even publicly spoken in their parliament. Now, Lambert, as a Pan-Africanist and a writer and following this thing closely, how do you feel this whole thing play out, as a sovereign country, being an Ethiopian or a Ugandan or Kenyan, having that amount of army from Egypt in Somalia? How do you view this in your own, words?
Mahlet, thank you again. I will have to put a caveat first. My internet doesn't look to be so stable, so I hope it doesn't disturb us along the way. First, and I think this is very important to say even before we.
Are you there, Lambert?
Mahlet, are we still on?
Yeah, but we didn't hear you. You just started. I think you can just start to answer the question. We didn't hear nothing.
Okay, let me just proceed. I was saying that first we need to appreciate that Somalia, like each of the other 54 African countries, is a sovereign nation. And that means sovereignty means that it has the prerogative and the right to engage in bilateral relationships with any country that it wants. Mm-hmm. We still have to add that in this respect, Somalia has the right to make its choices. It can decide to ally with any country in the world, any country in the Horn of Africa, any country within Africa. But this is looking at it from a very micro perspective, because regardless of the alliances that countries make, they must bear in mind the implications that such alliances have, first on their immediate neighbors, then by extension within the region of that where they are located, and then beyond the region where they are located to Africa as a continent. And then if you want to look at it bigger, you can take it to the black person perspective. Now, taking it from that context, the deployment of Egyptian troops in Somalia, regardless of the arrangement, the increased activity of foreign countries like Turkey in Somalia, also regardless of the arrangement that leads them to being there, is largely a Somali affair, stemming, of course, from its sovereign right to make such decisions. But in so making those decisions, the fear that one begins to have is that wisdom in making such decisions requires that you remain sensitive to the national interests of the countries that surround you, to the national interests of the region, in this particular case, the Horn of Africa, that you remain sensitive to the interests of Africa as a continent. Of course, like I said, Egyptian troop presence is of course the most recent. They have just landed in Somalia, and they come on the background of a defense cooperation agreement which Somalia signed with Egypt, I think in the last is it 2 months or 3? Then of course also they now come as part of the African Union Support and Stabilization Mission, AUSOM, that is supposed to succeed the current AU peacekeeping force, that is ATMIS. In Somalia, you have on the presence of AU troops in Somalia, the ones that have been there under ATMIS, and the one that Ethiopia has been a key part of, and other countries, including Uganda, Burundi, and I think two other African countries. But, until this moment, Egypt has not been part of any African Union peacekeeping force to Somalia. From the time that these forces came into being, I think that was in 2014, back in the last decade. When was the first, I think, AMISOM? In which year was that?
Mahlet? 2007 or 2000 before that.
Yes, I think that was when the over 10 any one of these missions. Now, at this particular point, Egypt has decided to join this peacekeeping mission. Now, like I said, Somalia has a right to decide, on which countries it can ally with. But the very fact that Egypt has decided to make itself available at this particular point in time raises questions that somebody has to begin to ask: why at this particular time? What exactly is the interest of Egypt in becoming part of these peacekeeping missions? And then beyond Egypt, the people who are responsible for validating and then endorsing which African countries can contribute to AU peacekeeping missions. These people, all these organizations, are they sensitive to the broader picture of geopolitics within the Horn of Africa? In this particular case, maybe we shall have that discussion later on. It is the peace and the peacekeeping arm of the PSC, Peace and Security Council of the African Union. That is the body within the African Union that's responsible of confirming and then sending these countries, which countries can get involved. You would want to ask yourself, are they conscious of the wider dynamics of peace within the Horn of Africa? What is the criteria that they use to decide which country can contribute peacekeeping forces? Of course, we know the mandate is to stabilize Somalia, but there are much bigger factors that you go to look at when you're choosing which countries are able to do that. Otherwise, the risk becomes, and like I said, we shall maybe have this discussion later on. The risk becomes that the countries that you send to another country to stabilize it and bring about peace get involved in other, get involved in promoting their national interests, even before the interests of that country. And those are the threats that the Peace and Security Council of the African Union should have taken into consideration when it was deciding which countries to deploy in the next peacekeeping mission in Somalia. That is the next, that is awesome. That is supposed to succeed at MIS.
Thank you, Lambert, for that, for sharing your view. Now, you have touched upon it, the ATMIS now, which is the living peacekeeping mission, and also the replacing one. Now, with regards to that, the African Union said the total amount of ATMIS is around 14,600 troops from all those 5 countries, which is the neighboring one. Now, the evacuation of ATMIS should not be endangering the security of another neighboring country. ATMIS was there to help, to stabilize, and to train also the Somali National Army. And when the National Army was able, ATMIS was anyway supposed to leave the country. Now that did not happen. Still, the Somali National Army is unable to do that. But now, to around 14,000 ATMIS troops being replaced by almost up to 10,000 Egyptian army. I don't know which other army is going to be added now, but it looks like more than 75% is dominated only by one country, and that one country has its historical problem and intention with a neighboring country, namely Ethiopia. So in this case, what was, first of all, what should be the Eastern African community's contribution towards to this? Because as we know, it was this year that Somalia has become a member of Eastern African community. Secondly, what should be this, the key, the part that the African Union should play, in terms of playing out this smoothly, in which all countries can benefit while Somalia being stable, supposedly.
Mahlet, you have mentioned something that's very interesting. Even if you play along with the figures, it raises quite significant issues in terms of what other countries which have interest within the region and which are going to be impacted by either the absence or presence of any foreign troops in Somalia. You mentioned that ATMIS was about 14,000 soldiers. Troops.
Yeah, 14,600.
That is from over five.
The African Union has, in fact, a written regulation somewhere saying that always peacekeeping mission is given to the immediate neighbors. Now go on, please. Sorry for
exactly. Now, 2 issues arise here. One, 14,000 troops coming from about 5 countries are now being replaced by troops constituting almost 10,000. That's over 80% from one country. That alone raises a lot of suspicions in regard to what's happening. In regard to the genuine interest, to the genuine motives behind the involvement of that specific country. Is it because other countries are not willing to contribute more troops to add up to the number? Is it because one of the fears that somebody else would want to raise in this respect is that Egypt contributing 10,000 troops in this particular case, about 80% of the troops that are going to be in Somalia, itself raises suspicion. Why do I say this? It is more like they are trying to gain entry into Somalia under the pretext of the Africa peacekeeping mission. What would be the motivation of sending all those soldiers to Somalia when other countries as well could contribute? Now, this would require us to go backwards to questioning how the criteria of the number of soldiers per country was arrived at by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. Those who decide the numbers and all that. But here is where we are already. Egypt is going to contribute about that 80%. And so we begin to ask ourselves, what is the implication in the region? Like you said, the first priority should be countries that are neighboring to Somalia. The countries that have interests in Somalia, in the stability of Somalia. It is not true, Mahlet, that countries outside Somalia, whether they are Egypt, whether they are this or that, it is not true that these countries can have more interest in Somalia more than countries around Somalia. So the first interest, if you're going to look for peacekeepers, should be countries around Somalia. And if even it is in terms of numbers, the countries around Somalia should contribute more numbers than even the countries outside, even if you're going to involve the rest. So the moment other countries have this take leadership in trying to bring stability to a country whose instability itself impacts its neighbors, it is not true that Ethiopia has lesser interest in Somalia more than Egypt, because instability in Somalia is also instability in Ethiopia. Instability in Somalia is instability in the other neighboring countries. I think these countries should have been given precedence in trying to bring peace back to Somalia. And I think this was the case under ATMIS. That's why you see Ethiopia has troops in Somalia. But also beyond that, you have to appreciate that Ethiopia does not have a choice on whether or not it can have troops in Somalia. Why do I say this? Because the stability of Somalia is largely consistent with stability in Ethiopia. One of the reasons Ethiopian troops are in Somalia are to stabilize Somalia, for the sole purpose that if Somalia is unstable, then it becomes a haven, which is what it has been, a haven for insurgents who themselves become a threat to Ethiopia as a country. So in sending troops to Somalia, Ethiopia is looking at its own interests, because the interests of the neighbor must be taken care of, otherwise it affects Ethiopia. So in this particular case, you begin to wonder, you would expect in any case that Ethiopia should have more troops in Somalia. And this is what should have been considered by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. You would expect that other East African countries, since Somalia has just joined the East African community, should be the ones sending more troops to Somalia. Because one of the benefits of being part of a community is that they get interested and get involved in the economic, security, and political welfare of a member country. That's what membership is. Otherwise, membership in the East African community then becomes useless. These are some of the things they should benefit. So we would understand if we had East African countries dominating the troop involvement in Somalia. Then you would say this involvement is courtesy of Somali membership in the East African community. You can therefore not justify Egyptian involvement unless you factor in the question of ulterior motives. And those motives, I don't know if you will discuss them later on in the show, but I can touch on them and say that Egypt clearly may not 100% be interested in the stability of Somalia, but would rather, or is in a sense trying to use Somalia as a Trojan horse. A Trojan horse is a way of introducing its presence within the borders of Ethiopia. And with that respect, if that be true, I don't want to say that it's true because it's all speculation, but if it be true, and of course Ethiopia and other neighboring countries have got to have the fear, have got to raise those kind of questions, because they have their other rivalry, they have other competing interests. We know that Ethiopia and Egypt are rivals in terms of geopolitics within the Horn of Africa. We know that Ethiopia and Egypt are competing in terms of so many other sectors. One of them is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. We know that Egypt wants to have an influence and have higher negotiating power insofar as controlling the dam is concerned. So given this competition between Ethiopia and Egypt that is so many miles away from Somalia, the presence of Egyptian troops within Somalia, for whatever reason, I don't want to say it is for ulterior motives, but like I said, if I'm in Ethiopia, if I'm in the neighboring country, I am going to have to ask myself, what exactly is the motive of Egypt in this case? I don't know if you will allow us later on to speculate on those motives. But for now, I'm just saying, if I'm within the neighborhood of Somalia, and I know that Egypt is my rival, I'm going to say, come on, look, Egypt, my rival, that has been threatening war with me, is bringing 10,000 soldiers just to my border. Whatever the reasons Egypt can give, I'm going to ask myself, what exactly is the motive of this? And I think that is the discussion that I predict is taking place within Ethiopia. That's the discussion that is taking place within the region, and that's the discussion that should take place within all the countries within the Horn of Africa that have interest in the stability of the Horn of Africa. Because if we don't have this discussion, And if this issue cannot be resolved in a manner that meets the interests of the neighbors, particularly Ethiopia, what we are going to have is an escalation of conflict within the region. Because you've seen already, it's just that we haven't really gone that deep to discuss those issues. But I know that the multifactorial nature of the issues that are involved here, including Somaliland, you know, are there. Somaliland is
You are frozen, Lambert.
they are a region that wants to are we still on Mahlet?
Yeah,
I thought I went
continue
off.
from Somaliland. From Somaliland.
Yes, Somaliland, leaders of Somaliland are already speaking of, you know, part of the controversy in Somalia and Ethiopia is the issue of Somaliland and Somalia. I want to put it on record that it is my personal belief and in the interest of the Pan-African consensus for the non-disintegration of African countries that Somaliland is part of Somalia. I've said this, and I know sometimes it strikes a good chord with others and bad with others, but I think in principle, the consensus we have as Africans is that we don't want we would rather that from currently we have about 54 independent African countries. We want to become 53, 52. We want to become 30, 20, and ultimately one, and unite us on, you know, the whole continent. So it is not in the interests of Pan-Africanism for us to divide or have more countries. So I am of the principle, and I've stood by this, that Somaliland is part of Somalia. But, you know, within the dynamics of the contest, the desire, the quest by Somaliland to separate from Somalia, that itself is an issue that has to be discussed based on its own merits. But in this particular case, we are saying part of the controversy is actually the threat of conflict, even war, you know, between these two regions. And we have heard when this news of Egypt coming into Somalia came up, we have seen threats by Somaliland saying they don't welcome it, threatening war, and then there's a multitude of issues. So what are some of the risks that we could get into with the Egyptian presence? If Egyptian presence is not welcome in the region, and I began by saying, Mahlet, that Somaliland has its sovereign responsibility, and it is within its rights to decide which country it allies with, but it cannot pursue these rights independent of the interests of its neighbors. This has to be very clear. You know, you are within your rights as a country to ally with anybody you want, but common sense states that you cannot do this outside the interests of your neighbors.
Yeah.
You know, and the issue about Egyptian involvement in this particular case, Mahlet, is that it is seemingly being done against the interests, the broader interests of the immediate neighbors. It doesn't matter who else speaks, who shares borders with Somalia. That partner, that country has a stake in the peace of Somalia. And Somalia cannot, therefore, engage in relationships. It cannot engage in alliances. It cannot engage in involve itself with foreign powers, foreign countries, to the extent that its neighbors are not comfortable, irrespective of its sovereignty. That's a fact. We don't live, unless if Somalia was living alone in a vacuum. But so long as you live with neighbors, if you're living in Uganda, whatever you do in regards to bringing other foreign countries to Uganda must not be independent of the interests of Kenya, the interests of Tanzania, because you share a border, and peace in your country or instability in your country impacts our country. So in this case, the danger of getting involved in Somalia is that it could lead to the escalation of hostilities. They are coming to stabilize. Of course, the motive of the African Union peacekeeping forces here, in this case, ATMIS, and then the one that will succeed them, you know, AWSOM, is to stabilize Somalia. In fact, if you read the next peacekeeping force is actually called the African Union Support and Stabilization Mission. It's more like to stabilize it. That is the mission we have been given. That is the objective in the open. While this is the objective, the risk, the danger, and the possibility is that it could actually lead to the escalation of violence of war, of conflict, of terrorism within Somalia.
Yeah.
It is not possible that Somalia can pursue geopolitical interests that endanger its neighbors and claim a sovereign right of a country. It has that right, but it can't be, it is not mutually exclusive. It's not different from the interests of the neighbors. I thought this interest needed to be factored in. Provided this interest, the interest of Somalia, of Ethiopia, and in this case, the interest of a region within Somalia, which could otherwise get into conflict with the main region of the country, have to be taken into consideration. Otherwise, the mission to keep and stabilize Somalia will not end well. It could actually, instead of bringing in peace, it could lead to destabilization of the region. That is my fear with Egyptian presence in Somalia.
And I think I agree there 100%. So forget Ethiopia, forget the region, but you, and as you said, it's Somalia's interest and with Somalia's right to partner with anyone in the world. But there are things that we are abide by, and we are members of community organization, regional organizations like the Eastern African Community, and Somalia is also a member state of the African Union. So it should have taken all those things into consideration. Okay, evacuate ATMIS. Now, the same thing that they are setting up AWSOM is the same objectives that ATMIS was mandated to do, to stabilize Somalia, to train the Somali National Army. But before that happened, the government of Somalia, because of its rift with Ethiopia, has decided just to evacuate that force, and then now replacing it with this. Now, for a moment, let's leave particularly Ethiopia, and even for that matter, let's leave the whole Horn of Africa, and let's talk about, in which you briefly touched upon, the motive behind this for Egypt really to bring such amount of weapon and army to the region. We all know that historically, not only with Ethiopia, Egypt has worked to destabilize the northeastern part of this continent, and it's not something that they even deny about it. So what is the motive for Egypt, and what is also the motive for Somalia in terms of achieving that goal of being a stable country in the Horn of Africa? And after so many 3 decades, when we say that Somalia started to be stable, then does it help it now to militarize itself with a non-neighboring country military like this, and including Turkey? Does it help in any way Somalia to be stable? And what is the motive of Egypt to have such a big military presence
Mahlet,
in the northeastern part of the continent?
I've heard you now. I think that, first of all, personally, I'm of the opinion that after 20 plus years, it is difficult for Somalia to remain in a place where it is still unable to secure itself by its own citizens, by its own army, by its own military. And I am personally of the opinion, I have been of this opinion before. Even the other peacekeeping missions, I have previously disagreed and said that you cannot be in a country and claim you're stabilizing it for 10 plus years. You have basically taken over the security of that country. And in so doing, it is not entirely, and it's not completely because you are interested in stabilizing that country. Sometimes I actually think that the interest of the hidden interest of having these foreign countries, whether it's Uganda under ATMIS to be in Somalia, is to keep it unstable, keep it weak, to keep it unable to defend itself, to keep it dependent on other countries. These are part of the geopolitics that are played. You can imagine after all these years. That is why I personally have high respect for some of the things Eritrea is doing as a country. Let me just bring this in. Eritrea is training Somali soldiers. And I think this is the best contribution. Train them, let them go back and defend their country. If you are in Somalia, part of it maybe was to train the soldiers. How long do you
But
need to train?
allow me to interrupt. Now, this happens by the invitation of the Somali government itself. Okay, I agree. Yes, train them. And that was also one of the mandate was ATMIS to train the Somali army. But you have a point there. After all these years, they are not able to defend themselves. But again, it is the invitation of the government. So what, although I would come up later on with the way forward questions, then what should be done then when it is by the invitation of the government? Disregarded?
Well, it is the government, it makes the decisions for the country. But like I said, the decisions of the government are not separable from the interests of Somalia as a country and of the Somali people. And then the interests of Somalia as a country are not separable from the interests of its immediate neighbors, Ethiopia and other countries. And then the interests in that respect are not separate from the interests of the region and the community to which Somalia belongs. I'll get back to the first question you asked over the issue of motives and all that. And I want to ask you, Mahlet, and anybody who is following our discussion, can you imagine a scenario where Egypt had taken the current move it has made to deploy its soldiers in Somalia without hiding under the umbrella of the African Union peacekeeping mission? What would have happened in the region? Just imagine Egypt and Somalia had agreed by themselves, because even this deployment is being brought under the cover of the African peacekeeping mission, mostly. So that makes it easy. That makes it appear like, well, we are going there for peace under the African Union. That doesn't mean that you're pursuing other interests. But I'm saying, had Egypt done this without using the cover of the African Union, the region already would be on fire. Ethiopia would have the right to respond based on their rivalry, on their competition. Now, it brings me back to what are the potential motives of Egypt. The potential motives of Egypt, I have said this over and over again, is that Egypt is trying to checkmate Ethiopia. I am personally of the opinion, I may not have concrete evidence, but it is just my instinct which tells me this. And following the history of these countries and common sense and then predictive thinking, you're able to see why Egypt would want its soldiers in Somalia. Take for instance, this is the first time since these missions were established that Egypt is getting involved. So why at this particular time? Because it comes at the time when it is having its most bitter quarrel with Ethiopia. Now, I personally think that Egypt is trying to checkmate Ethiopia. It may not be. I mean, it is part of it. It is part of negotiations. One, they could be increasing, building their leverage in negotiations. You know, Egypt and Ethiopia are locked in negotiations, particularly over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. That is the most important one. Now, when you're negotiating, it has got to a point where Egypt needs to flex its muscle. And I think that in trying to flex its muscle, it is trying to say we are in a position where we are able to respond both diplomatically and even militarily. And our military response depends on the stationing of our soldiers. Because then southern Egyptian soldiers that are coming, and maybe even more, are going to be stationed at the border with Ethiopia. God forbid it doesn't happen. In the event of war with Ethiopia, Ethiopia would be strategically disadvantaged. Is helping Egypt to give strategic advantage over Ethiopia in terms of troop deployment in the event possibly of conflict. This is what's happening. And if I'm a soldier, if I am Addis, if we are the military planners in Addis Ababa, we are already beginning to, I'm just saying, if I'm a military planner in Ethiopia, I'm already thinking, what are we going to do in case this happens? How do we, because if it goes ahead and Egypt deploys in Somalia, I can tell you that Ethiopia has got to undergo a military deployment reconfiguration. How do you deploy your soldiers? Where are they deployed? How are they stationed to counter any possible invasion, any possible attack from Egypt? If I'm Ethiopia, because it becomes a national threat. In this case, you are bringing the troops of my enemy to my doorstep. I am going to have a reconfiguration of my military. Of course, the other option, I have said this, but now I want to speak like I'm an Ethiopian, and I care about the interest of my country. I'm an Ethiopian leader. I'm Prime Minister Abiy. I am going to maintain military presence in Somalia as a way to check the presence of my opponent. So I can almost prophesy this, Mallet. Don't be surprised to find that Ethiopia will refuse to withdraw its military from Somalia. People will complain. The Somali will say, we don't want you here, but it has a stake. Ethiopia is within the right to protect the national security of Ethiopia. And that's why I began by saying that the interests of Somalia cannot be taken independent of the interests and the stability of the Horn of Africa region. And the decisions that Somalia makes, irrespective of its sovereignty, must be made with sensitivity to the interests of its neighbors and the Horn of Africa as a region. So I personally think that Egypt is using the deployment in Somalia not 100% in the interest of stabilizing Somalia. If Egypt was interested in stabilizing Somalia, it would have been there under AMISOM, the first peacekeeping contingent to Somalia. If Egypt was interested in stabilizing Somalia, it would have been there under ATMIS. Today it wants to join this forthcoming peacekeeping force because it has interest. Basically, this is a game of interest. Egypt wants to use Somaliland as a way as leverage over Ethiopia. I feel bad for Somalia because at this point in time, I can see Somalia becoming a proxy battleground for foreign forces. I can see Somalia lending itself to becoming host to war between countries that are not Somalia, that have nothing to do with Somalia. I can see Somalia becoming a battleground for Egypt and Ethiopia. If war breaks out, it won't be between Ethiopia and Somalia, it will be between Ethiopia and Egypt. And yet, in this particular case, the war will take place on Somaliland. In this particular case, the people, the majority of the civilians who will get affected by the war are those in Somalia. This is my fear for Somalia. And I've engaged a number of Somalis who say, it's our right. We decide who comes to our country. We decide who this and this. Now, Ethiopia will say it's also our right to ensure that our country is safe. Exactly. In case everybody wants to be interested in their national interests. In case Ethiopia is to entirely say, me, I'm interested in purely Ethiopia. Somalia also purely Somalia. At the end of the day, it is war. That's why we have regions. That's why we have cooperation. That's why we have these regional bodies. Our interests are not separate from the interests of these regional bodies. And I think that I know, Mahlet, I need to say this, that Somalia is in a difficult place. And I personally feel that to lead Somalia at this point in time needs a lot of wisdom and maneuver. I'm not sure the current Somali president is up to the task. I've asked, I know in some of my Twitter engagements, I asked that geopolitics, which I think is at play right now in Somalia, geopolitics is like a chess game. You've got to ask yourself as a country, what piece are you? What piece in this game, in this chessboard, think of it as a chessboard. Are you a knight? A knight can move, a knight has some influence, but it's limited. Are you the queen who is able to do this and that? Or are you a pawn who is dispensable? I think that Somalia is lending itself to the role of the pawn, the dispensable one. Because in this case, it is going to be the one that suffers. It is going to be the one that, because ask yourself, Mahlet, ask yourself, were there no options which could not risk war? Were there no options which could not risk instability in Somalia? Were there no other countries which were willing to contribute troops without conflicting with the neighbors of Somalia? If those countries were there, wouldn't you rather go with countries whose presence is not likely to escalate tensions in your region? So I imagine if I'm the leader of Somalia and I'm not interested in escalating tensions within the region, then I'm going to make sure I don't invite the enemy of my neighbor to be in my house, honestly. So how we handle it, for me now, the question is, and I think what will happen in the next few weeks and months is how Ethiopia will choose to respond. Ethiopians are going to say, we are within our rights as a country to protect the interests and the security, the national security of Ethiopia. And in so doing, we are going to deploy at the border, or we are going to make sure that our soldiers who are in Somalia cannot leave. So we are going to enter a stalemate. What then happens? In that case, I see a very difficult situation playing out in the next few days. And I think that, and in this respect, Mahlet, I think part of the people who need to be faulted is the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, the ones who are in charge deciding which countries are sent under peacekeeping missions. Did they consider the fact that there are latent issues, regional issues within Somalia, which they needed to factor in deciding to allow Egypt to get involved? Did they consider the fact that one of the neighbors to Somalia has a contention with Egypt and would not see this deployment in friendly terms? Has the Peace and Security Council of the African Union been manipulated? Were there other external influences? Now, you see, I'm beginning to think backwards. I'm thinking the interest in Somalia and in destabilizing the Horn of Africa, particularly targeting, in this case, maybe Ethiopia, could actually be bigger than even Egypt. How do you checkmate? How do you, keep Ethiopia in line to meet your interests? Sometimes the information we get, Mahlet, in the media is very limited. Actually, in most cases, it is the information they want us to get, and the one they can't keep away from us. But if you want to follow things and understand how the world operates, you've got to think to ask yourself, what would they not want me to know? Because what they don't want you to know, they don't tell you. It is by accident. It is through WikiLeaks that you get to know it. So in this case, I ask myself, what is that I would not, that people would, that the background powers that run our world would want us not to know in this respect? I could actually speculate, Mahlet, that Egyptian involvement in Somalia could be bigger than Egypt itself.
Yeah.
Because you cannot tell me, Mahlet, that the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, which is responsible for this deployment, was not aware of the likely conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia. They know this. They have mediated over Egypt and Ethiopia. They know that there is no way any reasonable leader of a country like Ethiopia, no way any country, whether it was Uganda bordering Somalia, and Uganda is an enemy to Egypt, there is no way they will sit back and watch the troops of a country that is hostile to us coming to our border and sit back. Now, it means the Peace and Security Council of the African Union was aware that there is this conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia. Why then did they go ahead and allow a country like Egypt to deploy in Somalia? And you saw the letter by Ethiopia. They didn't take it directly, but they have shown they are not happy and they will not sit back and watch, events unfolding that become a threat to the security of Ethiopia. Was the Peace and Security Council of the African Union that made the decision to deploy not just Egyptian troops, but 10,000 Egyptian troops, enough to destabilize a sections to lead to conflict with Ethiopia? Was the Peace and Security Council of the African Union not aware that this would happen? No, they were aware. So did they make the decision to accept? I want to put myself like I'm a member of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, and I want to claim that to put myself in a place where I'm aware that this could easily happen. For me to go ahead and deploy Egyptian soldiers in Somalia, when I'm aware that it's likely to escalate tensions with Ethiopia, and the opposite of what I'm intending happens. Because in this case, you want peace, you want to stabilize Somalia, but deploying Egypt could actually further escalate and cause destabilization. But you go ahead, it means that you are not within either you are careless and you don't know that this can happen, which I don't believe is true. They know this could happen. So I'm thinking, was there another bigger Uncle Sam who had an influence and said, we want, now this is all speculation. I want to put this caveat because I don't have evidence, but I'm trying to ask us to think. I'm trying to ask Africans. I'm trying to ask neighbors. I'm trying to ask those who care about peace in Somalia and in the Horn of Africa to think about the things. Nobody will say this in the open. This is what happens in the back room. Could some big Uncle Sam? It could be the European Union. It could be the US. Because they hold the sway. They control the AU. I've said this before. The AU basically implements what its funders, majority the West ones, could they have gone to the air and said that we want Egyptian troops to be stationed in Somalia, and to be stationed in Somalia for two reasons. One, to build up the leverage of Egypt, because in this case, it could mean that literally Ethiopia could say, no, I'm fearing, if we don't accept to stop the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, Egypt will attack. So they are trying to weaken the hand of Ethiopia in negotiations. The question, and you see, Mahlet, now this is really deep thinking. Don't forget that Ethiopia at this particular moment is having internal challenges. If I want to untwist the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, because outside the geopolitics, outside the interstate competition, the interstate rivalry with other countries, there is also the internal strife within Ethiopia. Can one leader, in this case, Prime Minister Abiy, can he manage to contain the internal divisions within Ethiopia and at the same time engage in interstate war with Egypt? It is asked too much, very difficult. Now, it would be easy if the war with Egypt were not but once it becomes likely, then they are going to deploy in Somalia. Then in the background, they'll go to Abiy and say, now, in your country with Amhara and this and this and this and this, it's already a full plate for you. It's also possible you will soon enter war with Egypt. Do you want that? Ethiopia would say, I don't want that, because it is difficult to contain. Could it be that now, to avoid this, why do this and this and this with their Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam? So they are going to force the Prime Minister and the government of Ethiopia to make concessions on the issues where they are contesting with Egypt and maybe the West. They are going to, it's called compel, to force you indirectly to accept concessions in the background, because they're going to say, okay, fine, if you don't, this will happen. This is likely to happen. And you're seeing troops at your border, and it's possible they can actually engage in war. Now, if you refuse and it happens, it's possible you will lose power. These are the things which happen at the background, Mahlet, of politics. So the question becomes, who is doing this? You ask yourself, what would any country, Mahlet, in this case, if you want to find out the truth, anybody interested, what would countries outside Ethiopia, what concessions does Egypt, in this case, want from Ethiopia? What concessions does the West and Europe want from Ethiopia? If you know those concessions, then you must understand that is the ultimate objective. It is not, and I'm telling you this again, if tomorrow you hear that they have finally made a decision, Egypt is not deploying 10 southern troops in Somalia, they're only going to deploy maybe 1 southern, just to keep up an appearance, then you should become suspicious that my government has made some concession. This is the difficulty. This is the science of geopolitics.
Okay.
If I'm an Ethiopian, I'll be like, okay, what has the government given in return?
Yeah.
Because the government also looks at it is survival. It doesn't want things which could, threaten the survival of the government. Prime Minister Abiy doesn't want to leave power. Doesn't want to be removed through war or through internal conflict. Because for now, without war, he already has a number of issues internally within Ethiopia. So people outside are taking advantage of this and applying pressure. So that's where we are. I have said this, and that I refuse to follow the obvious path that is being carved for everybody to think. I'm thinking, what do they want us to know? Who are the players they don't want us to know? You understand? Who are these players they don't want us? How did we arrive in a place where we could actually slide into more conflict? How did an organization that is supposed to make sure this doesn't happen actually become part of it? I have an issue with the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. And how did they get involved when they know it is going to lead to the escalation of conflict? Maybe their hands are tied maybe Big Sam, who is in charge funding the African Union, said we want Egypt to deploy in Somalia. But if they go directly, Ethiopia will be within the right. Everybody will understand and say, if Egypt has gone to Somalia, it means they're planning to attack Ethiopia. So Ethiopia should respond quickly. That's the discussion we will be having. But for now, they have put Ethiopia in a difficult place. How do you respond? Egypt will simply say, we're here under the African Union peacekeeping force. But you know inside you that they can turn at any one point. And in any case, there is reconnaissance, there is intelligence gathering. You now have Egyptian soldiers within your borders. They can do this if they want. So who is this? Where does the chain begin from? Does it begin from Europe? Does it begin from the West, applying pressure on the African Union and saying that we want Egypt to deploy in Somalia so that we can pressure the Ethiopian government to accept to stop the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam? If we send them there directly, it will be so open that Ethiopia will respond and people will support Ethiopia and say they are right to respond. But if we send Egyptian troops under the pretext of the African Union, we can say no, but they are there under the mandate of the African Union. So I think all this politics. So I think this issue could be bigger than Egypt. Egypt itself, that's why I said, Mahlet, at the end of the day, that what we have here is geopolitics, and it is like a chessboard.
Yeah.
And I asked you, I remember at the beginning, that every country that's involved has got to ask itself, what am I in this chessboard? Am I the queen? Am I the knight? Am I the pawn? In theory, hypothetically, the non-Africans, the Europeans, the West, in case they're involved, and I suspect they are involved, are the queen. In Egypt itself has a lot to gain, but it's a knight. It has a limited space of movement, but it also moves better than the pawn. And in this case, I think Somalia makes itself a pawn. Actually, there are two knights here: Egypt and Ethiopia. All of them can move their pieces, limited, but they can move. But in this case, Somalia makes itself a pawn, dispensable in this thing. So the interest in this, for me, are much bigger, and we shall only see and understand what is taking place once we refuse to be dragged along a particular line of thinking. You know, they want us to think it's purely Egypt because Egypt quarrels with Ethiopia. What if Egypt is also being used to pressure Ethiopia to serve particular interests which are good to Egypt but also good to others? This is the train of thinking I would be interested in. But you see, public domain thinking finds it very difficult to pursue this kind of thinking. People, you know, we often respond and discuss issues that are given to us. Like I told you, if you want to understand how geopolitics works, you've got to say, what do they want me to know? And then you will know the truth. Everything you know, they want you to know. Honestly, the only way you can know other things is when you find it out in your own way, maybe via WikiLeaks, through leaks and all that. Otherwise, nobody wants you to know. Egypt doesn't want you to know that its interest is to pressure Ethiopia to stop filling the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The US doesn't want you to know that its interest is to pressure the government of Ethiopia to accept or remove subsidies or privatize more of Ethiopian state parastatals. I see so many things happening, by the way, in Ethiopia. I don't normally talk about them, but I think that they're not good for Ethiopia as a country, but serve the interests of the West. Do you know why most African countries have failed? Privatization and other corporate interests in the country. And most African countries, which were very powerful, have been held back because they were forced to adopt IMF policies. This brings me to the idea of IMF in Ethiopia. There must be policies, I'm speculating, that they want Ethiopia to adopt. And the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, because he knows it is bad for Ethiopia, is refusing to adopt them. But how do you pressure him to adopt them? Send in Egypt. Tell him you could have war. So to avoid this, for us to get involved, please adopt this. These are things we cannot know. These are things we aren't told in the public domain. But like I said, if you want to understand how politics works, you've got to ask yourself, what don't they want me to know? And you begin to follow the trail. Look at what's happening in Ethiopia. What do you think is happening in Ethiopia? That wouldn't be for the best of Ethiopia, but the government is doing it. Now, when I say this, Ethiopians are going to say, this and this, don't support the government. But it is true. I don't like IMF. I know many countries which have failed because of IMF. I know so many African countries. Actually, IMF is the biggest problem to Africa's development. And IMF, until of
I agree.
Until of recent, was not a factor in Ethiopia, was it?
You find no country which has a successful story or development after signing with IMF.
Exactly, but Ethiopia is signing, and there should be so many other things, I'm sure. So how do you? This is all under background politics. How do you push Ethiopia to do this? How do you compel? Compel is by force, but it's soft force. This you have to consider the likelihood that the involvement, Mahlet, of Egypt in Ethiopia is part of a broader game. That's why I say that I sympathize with Somalia, because at the end of the day, they are becoming a playground for Egypt. They are becoming a playground for other foreign forces. I think that the interests of Somalia can best be met through good and neighborly relationship with Ethiopia, with other countries that surround Somalia. I know that they have issues. The issue of the MOU, I have said this and I will again say it on record. I don't support the MOU. I think it was ill-advised by Ethiopia to get involved. I think it wasn't wise to sign the MOU. I think that Ethiopia also has a part to blame in all of this. I think that it wasn't wise for them to go ahead. They could have still, by the way, again, let me put this caveat. I don't disagree with Ethiopia having access to the sea. The question is, how do you get access to the sea? I think they use their own means. Just like, by the way, I don't disagree with the Somaliland with Somalia pursuing peace and stability within Somalia. The question is, how do you pursue it? Somalia is pursuing it wrongly by inviting the enemy of its neighbor, which could further lead to more conflict. So I think that's my position on that, Mahlet.
Yeah, no, thank you very, very, very much, Lambert. Really, I didn't want to stop you, but you really have elaborated it beautifully in a very understanding language and scenario, even, putting a scenario for us. So, no one could have said it better than what you have just portrayed for us. So bottom of line, Egypt is, I have asked here the motive behind leaving out Ethiopia and the region, the motive of Egypt, and also what would Somalia get out of this in terms of achieving that goal, being stable. So Egypt is basically checkmating Ethiopia by doing so, and then Somalia is back to square one, where it was almost 3 decades before. What is coming is, as you said, it's something bigger than destabilizing Somalia. It's bigger than Ethiopia, bigger than Egypt. In fact, I really wanted to share this here. I don't know if you have paid attention. It came 5 days ago. This was published by the New York Times. The coming war nobody is talking about, and it tells you there it's something bigger than what we are even talking about right now. So I encourage everyone to go and read that article. It gives you really, wow, what are these people thinking? And you will see that it's more than the interest of Ethiopia or some other neighboring countries or Egypt. It's something with the upper hand, always what we call the invisible hands. It's just, it's crazy. So I think we have took enough time, so maybe I will just ask you quickly, in a latest development today, we have read that Djibouti is offering access to the sea, direct access to the sea, to Ethiopia, to a new port that they're setting up. I believe it's a different port than what Ethiopia have been renting there. But what's your view? I know you have your stance with the MOU Ethiopia signed with Somaliland, but what's your view on that? And then together, if you can conclude it with a way forward in general, briefly. Thank you.
I'm trying to get myself, I'm moving, I'm trying to get myself to a quiet place where we can continue the conversation for a few minutes. I'm sorry, I'm in a place where
No, it's okay. You are trying your best to make this happen. In the meantime, I see. Thank you very much, all of you, for your engagement here. Child of God. Okay, Mohammed Jama, sojourner. Lambert, are you in a
Yes,
convenient
Mallet.
place now?
Okay, fine. Can we just
Yeah, we are going to conclude it. Two things: your quick reflection
continue
on
now?
Djibouti offering direct access to the sea to Ethiopia. Alternatively, it's a latest development that came out today. What's your view? Because I know your stance, what you have with the MOU, Ethiopia and Somaliland, and then
Mallet,
with that concluding the way forward. Okay.
could you ask again? I missed that.
Okay, sorry. I was asking your reflection on Djibouti offering to Ethiopia a direct access to the sea, just like what Ethiopia is trying to get
No,
with
Mallet,
Somaliland.
let me tell you, um, what Ethiopia wants is access to the sea. How it gets access to the sea is for me is what matters. How it pursues access to the sea is what matters. Whether it gets it through Somalia, whether it gets it through Djibouti, or it gets it through Eritrea, for me isn't really the issue, because for a country that has ambitions to be a regional power, maybe even a global, because Ethiopia is a very ambitious country. Nobody denies this. Ethiopia is very ambitious, but Ethiopia is limited by lack of access to the sea. Now, I know, let me tell you, any country, any leader who loves Ethiopia, whether it's Prime Minister Abiy or the next government or the one that comes after, would want to make sure, I mean, any leader who would be interested in building up Ethiopia as a regional power and a power within Africa would want access to the sea. That much is true. So long as you love, actually, let me tell you something that some Ethiopians themselves don't understand. And I know it's because of the domestic quarrel, domestic arguments within Ethiopia. Ethiopia will have so much and everything to gain by having access to the sea. It will be a game changer for Ethiopia as a country. You know, so if I'm an Ethiopian, I want access to the sea at all costs. No, sorry, I don't say at all costs, because then it brings us to a point where we ask, how then do you pursue this access? And me as Lambert, that's where I have a bit of an issue. How Ethiopia manages to get access to the sea, the means it uses, for me is what's important, because the fact is, as a country, Ethiopia is landlocked. It doesn't have a direct access to the sea. And that is the reality. It cannot change. If it wants access to the sea, it can only get it through war, which of course nobody says is a wise option, or it can get it through diplomacy. If Djibouti has offered, I think it is one option. If Eritrea offers, it's a second option. If Somalia offers, it's another option. I think that I can only say that the most important is that Ethiopia pursues its ambitions to gain access to the sea through a manner that is sustainable. One of the things I think why Ethiopia is very much interested in access to the sea through Somaliland is because it has that kind of access is independent of possible of
And
potential.
financially, it's very feasible for Ethiopia. It's just 20 kilometer, and yeah, and also the security.
Exactly. So there are many reasons. Financially, also in terms of control, because you know, one of the ways for a country that's ambitious like Ethiopia would want is to have complete control, not to own something or have something in a way that can be switched off anytime they want. Because Djibouti can give you a port, and then the next time you have a quarrel with the US, their Uncle Sam, they simply tell them to take it away. What do you do? You know? So
Yeah.
so this is the difficult situation Ethiopia has. But I believe that Ethiopia seems to see as a high level of control and independence if it does this with Somaliland and Somalia. And I think that's why Ethiopia is very much interested in Somaliland, because getting it from Ethiopia also hasn't historically had the best relationship with Eritrea. So getting also from Eritrea, they can one day choose to stop you, and it's done. Everything falls apart. You go to Djibouti, fine. You have a smaller quarrel with the US, they tell Djibouti, please Stop there. So the very access becomes a negotiating chip for Ethiopia's enemies. Ethiopia is trying to look for a port where its enemies cannot use as a
Exactly.
negotiation chip against Ethiopia. And I think Somaliland does that. And let me tell you, if I'm to speak selfishly, I don't know whether it's okay. I'm in the outside, a lot of wind is blowing, but I have no way. Inside, there's a bit of noise in the hall I was sitting. So, what am I saying, Mahlet? I'm saying that to speak selfishly, if I am Ethiopia, can you imagine, in case let's imagine a scenario where tomorrow it becomes possible, it happens that Somaliland actually gives Somalia access to the sea. And they strike an agreement, Somaliland becomes independent. Somaliland would forever owe everything it has to Ethiopia. So it's almost not possible that such access can be used against Ethiopia at any one point. So I believe that this is what Ethiopia would rather have: access that cannot be used at any one point. You know, the kind of influence on the port that others can't use to pressure it to do their own thing. And I think that's why they want Somaliland as a first option. But like I said, at the end of the day, if there are other options, and depending on the interest of Ethiopia, let them pursue them. What's important is that Ethiopia pursues this interest in a manner that does not also lead to the, that does not destabilize the region at the end of the day. And I think this is the matter that so far Ethiopia has with Somalia.
Also, the matter, the fact of Somaliland being independent or not is questionable by itself. I know that we have a different view because we know that a lot of countries have their offices and consulate offices have been acting like one for several decades. But let's leave it like that. We got the reflection of you on Ethiopia's access to the sea, reflecting on Djibouti's offer. Now let's conclude it. The way forward. You have touched upon it. The way forward in terms of as a part of Eastern African community. The way forward. What should be part the key role for the African Union. Once again, reminding us Africans and people particularly who are living in the region. And then, yeah, that's where we close it. Thank you.
Mahlet, the first way forward is to return to the status quo. Go back to the status quo and keep things the way they are first. Then re-strategize, reconfigure the mode of peacekeeping in some. Okay. The number of way forwards. I think the most straightforward one would be that Somalia needs to be able to stand by itself. Somalia needs to be able to secure its borders by itself. No country, even Ethiopia, shouldn't be in Somalia. Ideally, it is Somali who should control Somalia. So the idea of peacekeeping forces in Somalia, whether from the East African world, is an issue that the Somali need a national consensus among themselves. And to say this is our country, we need to take charge of our country. At some point, I gave a very radical solution. I said we should leave the Somali, no peacekeeping. Let them kill themselves until they sit on a negotiating table. Yes, because let me tell you, Mahlet, if these people are allowed to fight, they're allowed. At the end of the day, when one wins, he will be able to secure the whole country. That is a very radical thinking, but it is one way that works in other places. If the Somali are left to handle their matters, you see this idea of saying that terrorists have taken over government. Those terrorists are Somali. If they take the government, they are Somali. They will run the country. And if the people are tired of them, the people can throw them out. There is no government that is more powerful than the people. So if you get a bad government, you can throw out the bad government. That is the most radical way forward. And if I was a Somali, I would say we need to sit down as Somali and see how do we secure our country. Otherwise, they are going to become a playing ground for foreign forces. Today you have troops from Ethiopia, from Egypt, from Uganda for 20 years plus. When will you take care of your country? When will Somalia stand on its feet, train its soldiers, and secure its borders? Otherwise, if you have minerals, they
I think Lambert is frozen again. It's a problem of internet, but hopefully he will come back. East Africa, GBM said, East Africa cost militarized by USA, China, EU, Turkey, Arabs, but not a single African naval force. I mean, basically, what we have is right now, Turkey, you know, they have two agreements, Somalia with Turkey. One is running its maritime, and then the other one is with that has to do taking out a crude oil from Somalia, and it has started to do so. But it's the same reason that the US had its 2 years war against Somalia, in which, you know, they were then the Somalis have defeated them and they ran out of the country, and AMISOM replacing them. Okay. But now it is the same thing. What the US was trying to get this resource of oil from Somalia, and the same thing now Somalian government is allowing for for Turkey to do so. So I really don't know. This is why I said Somalia is back to square one for me. And that's really unfortunate. Lambert is trying to come in. Yeah. This shouldn't be, you know, let me just say this shouldn't be, I know some of you will come and say, oh, you are Ethiopian, your government, this and that. But at the end of the day, this is politics. And it shouldn't be, we should be able to argue and reason out reasonably and with evidences and with issues that matters to us as people, as citizens of not only to our respective countries, but also as an African. That's the only way to advance, you know, humanity even in general. So I really would love to have the view of a Somali or a Somalilander or anyone from that's why today I have not non-Somali, non-Egyptian, but non-Ethiopian, but just a Pan-African person and from the region. How do we view this thing? So so we all learn, come from it, whether we agree or to disagree. But I really hope to have a panel in which that brings everyone to the table, meaning online, and we can share our view. I see that Lambert, maybe he's not able to come back. Yeah, let me just see if he. Yeah, there were some interesting points that he was bringing as a way forward. Really, first of all, he pointed out. Firstly, let's leave. You know, he said, thinking selflessly. Let the region leave the matter of Somalia to Somalis and let them figure it out, whether it's a war or whatever. Do you agree with this one? What do you think is the opportunity or the challenge that come with it? Comment below. And in general, on the whole topic of the presence of the heavy military of Egypt in Somalia, the motives, and does it serve the interest of Somalia at all? Well, how does it impact the region, to the stability of the region? How should Ethiopia react in terms of defending its own, national security or national interest, having its historical animosity with Egypt, now that it's just these militaries around its border? How should Ethiopia deal with it? And what should be the say of the Eastern African community or the neighboring countries? And what should be the say of the role that the African Union should play into this, because this had not come without the knowledge of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. But it should not have allowed it, because stabilizing one country should not be by jeopardizing the national security of a neighboring country. This is absolutely wrong, and they know it. So what are the concessions that went behind the scene that they do not want to tell us? This is really, and in the midst of all this, you see that this New York Times and Financial Times, Bloomberg, they are all the mouthpiece of the imperialists. And 5 days ago, the New York Times has came out with the title of this, the coming war nobody's talking about in the Horn of Africa. You go and Google it and read that. It will tell you, there are more hands, invisible hands, or perhaps visible, bigger than this thing. It's all that geopolitics game by at the expense of lives in the region, like a proxy war. Okay. And that's really sad. So let us know in the comment section, what do you think of this? Or yeah, sorry. Thank you, Red CUs, for reminding that I have muted myself. No, I said I was just trying if he can log in, but it looks like he's totally cut out from internet. Yeah, it's a pity that he couldn't share those way forward points. They were interesting, but anyway, I think let me just conclude it. And yeah, thank you very much. I have asked some questions. I hope you have heard me. Comment below once this streaming is over. What do you think should be the role of the neighboring countries, the role of the Eastern African community, the role of the African Union in all this, tension between Ethiopia and now Egypt and Somalia? To try to stabilize one country, which is good, but should not be at the expense of jeopardizing others' security, other neighboring countries' security. That is what the point is. So wherever you are, as an African, seeing yourself as an Ethiopian or whatever, whether you are from Somalia or Egypt or Somaliland, let us hear your view, or from wherever you are. Thanks again for tuning in, for engaging, for commenting, for contributing. We don't take it for granted. Please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Give it a like if you like what we bring you here. So please give it thumbs up and share the video with others, please. That will help us to reach out more. And don't keep the information and knowledge only to yourself. And if you may also support us through our PayPal account, which you can find in the description section. You can go ahead and visit also Lambert's website. It's called africainterest.org. It has really very, very interesting articles you can support. And you can also check us, our articles at connect2africa.org as well. That was it for now. Yes, at Red CUs, let me just share with you. You were asking our Twitter, right? Let me just share it here before I log in out. And then our website is here. Okay. And our email is, you can write to us through this email. Thanks again, and bye-bye. I'll see you on the next one.